In an unexpected and historic movement, former U.S. President Donald Trump recently met with the new Syrian leader Ahmed Allah in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. This meeting marked the first time in 25 years that leaders from the United States and Syria were facing face to discuss the future of the region. The importance of this meeting cannot be underestimated. It represents a dramatic change in international relations in the Middle East, which for decades have been marked by conflicts, sanctions, and deep tensions. But who is Ahmed Allah? To understand the weight of this meeting, we need to go back a little in time. Ahmed Allah is a figure that emerged from the ashes of the Syrian civil war, a former rebel who, in 2024, managed to overthrow the Assad regime, which had ruled the country for over 40 years with iron hand. Contrary to popular belief, Ahmed did not just repeat the mistakes of the past. He actively seeks to distance himself from the radical image that many associated with Syrian rebels, adopting a more moderate, pragmatic, and diplomatic stance to attract international support. This change in posture has been fundamental to break the isolation of Syria, which for years has suffered severe economic sanctions imposed by the US and allies. These sanctions, which began in the age of Bashar al-Assad, aimed to isolate the country and contain the influence of Iran, one of the main allies of the Syrian regime. Iran, in turn, uses Syria as a strategic basis to project its power in the Middle East, especially through support for groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon. Therefore, Donald Trump's announcement during the Riyadh meeting that economic sanctions against Syria would be raised was received as a true geopolitical bomb. The suspension of these sanctions opens the doors for the country to become integrated into world trade and receive external investments, especially Western companies that once avoided the Syrian market because of the political and economic risk. Ahmed Allah made clear his intention to transform Syria into an attractive destination for investments, especially in the country's reconstruction, which was devastated by the long civil war. Millions of people were displaced, whole cities were ruined, and the economy collapsed. Opening for foreign investment is seen as a fundamental step in raising Syria, creating jobs and improving the life of the population. But this change is also linked to a greater desire: normalizing Syria's relationships with the rest of the world, especially with the United States and Israel. During the negotiations, Trump pressured Ahmed Allah to move towards peace with Israel, aligning with Abraham's Agreement, a series of normalization treaties that already include countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. The entry of Syria in this group could radically change the balance of power in the Middle East, breaking decades of hostility and transforming the country into a strategic ally to Washington and its regional partners. However, this approach is not simple. Trump also required Syria to expel foreign terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, which has direct support from Iran. This requirement is part of a greater effort to weaken Iranian influence in the region, seen as a direct threat to U.S. interests and their allies. In this context, Saudi Arabia played a key role. Prince Mohammed bin Salman was a key piece to convince Trump to change U.S. posture from Syria, helping to consolidate Ahmed Allah as a more moderate and acceptable leader for the international community. This change in alignment has a direct impact on the historical rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has intensified since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The removal of Iran-Syria strengthens the Saudi position, which seeks to limit the expansion of Iranian influence and reaffirm its role as regional power. In addition, a Syrian aligned with Israel and the United States can weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is seen as an armed arm of Iran and a constant source of instability. Still, even with potential economic and safety gains, the normalization process faces many challenges. Internally, Ahmed Allah needs to deal with political resistance and sectors of the population that are contrary to this approach to Israel. Regionally, peace is still a delicate terrain, full of uncertainties and tensions that can undermine the advances made so far. But one thing is certain: the meeting in Riyadh opened a new page in the history of the Middle East, with possibilities that few dared to imagine recently. The meeting between Donald Trump and Ahmed Allah in Riyadh was not just a symbolic meeting. It represents a complex strategic movement that can reconfigure alliances in the Middle East and redefine the role of the United States in the region. Since the end of the Cold War, the Middle East has been the scene of conflicts that intertwine with international interests, involving regional and global powers, and Syria has always been one of the central points of these disputes. Therefore, this diplomatic opening makes room for a reinterpretation of the geopolitical game. The suspension of economic sanctions against Syria, announced by Trump, has direct implications for the Syrian economy, which for years lived under an almost total isolation regime. With sanctions, many sectors of the economy were paralyzed, making it difficult to reconstruction and access to essential resources. The release of these economic barriers will allow Syria to import and export products more easily and receive financial help from international and private institutions, which is fundamental to the reconstruction of war-devastated infrastructure. This movement is also strategic for the United States, who sees Syria's reconstruction an opportunity to contain the influence of Iran and Hezbollah, which act strongly in the region, using Syria as the basis for their operations. With Ahmed Allah seeking to distance himself from these forces, Washington hopes to weaken this axis and create a more moderate counterweight and aligned with his interests. At the same time, the U.S. wants to ensure that Syria will not turn into fertile ground for terrorist groups that threaten regional and international stability. Another important aspect of the meeting in Riyadh was the emphasis on the normalization of relations between Syria and Israel. Abraham's Agreement, which was once a watershed to the Middle East, brought new actors to the negotiating table, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The possibility of Syria joining this group reinforces the trend of pragmatic diplomacy, focusing on regional economic and security cooperation, despite the deep wounds caused by past conflicts. However, normalization is not a linear process. Syria has a history of hostility with Israel that dates back to the founding of the Israeli state in 1948 and the various subsequent wars. This hostility is rooted in both territorial issues and the dispute for the Golan region, and in ideological and religious disputes that cross generations. Therefore, Ahmed Allah will need to navigate carefully to balance international demands with internal pressures, which include groups that still resist any approximation with Israel. The performance of Saudi Arabia, represented by Prince Mohammed bin Salman, was decisive for changing American posture. Riyadh is interested in promoting a more stable and aligned Middle East against Iran, its main regional opponent. The facilitation of this meeting demonstrates the growing role of Saudi Arabia as a regional mediator and its ability to influence great global powers. In addition, the strategic alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia gains a new dimension with this approach between Washington and Damascus. This Saudi-Iran-Arabian rivalry is one of the central motors of the Middle East policy since 1979, when the Iranian Islamic Revolution radically changed the balance of power in the region. Iran seeks to expand its influence, while Saudi Arabia tries to contain this advance and maintain its position as leader of the Arab world and Sunni Islam. Syrian side change, which for decades has been a firm ally of Iran, represents a significant scam to Tehran and can alter the strategic calculations of all involved. However, even with all these advances, the region remains volatile. Sectarian tensions, divergent interests of foreign powers, and the traumatic memories of the Syrian civil war complicate any attempt at lasting pacification. Internally, Ahmed Allah faces challenges to consolidate his power and implement political and economic reforms that can ensure stability and prosperity. The Syrian population, tired of years of conflict, observes with expectation and distrust the changes to come. In addition, standardization with Israel can generate adverse reactions of radical groups and traditional political forces that still have great influence in the country. Syria, as a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional country, is experiencing a delicate internal balance, and any external change can trigger internal tensions that threaten fragile peace. Therefore, the future of this new era of diplomatic relations depends not only on leaders' decisions, but also on Iran's ability to dialogue with their opponents and build national consensus. The promise of foreign investments is one of the pillars for this transformation. Syrian reconstruction requires billions of dollars to repair infrastructure, basic services, and reactivate the economy. Western companies, hitherto removed because of sanctions and political risk, now see an opportunity to operate in an emerging market with significant growth potential. This influx of capital can be decisive for the resumption of development, as well as strengthening the image of the new Syrian regime as a reformist force and open to the world. At the same time, this process brings risks and uncertainties. Economic reconstruction needs to be accompanied by advances in human rights, transparency, and combat to corruption, so that the benefits effectively reach the population. The international community will be attentive to ensure that help and investments do not strengthen authoritarian interests or illicit practices that may undermine stability. This delicate balance will be one of the main challenges for Ahmed Allah and his partners. The meeting between Donald Trump and Ahmed Allah in Riyadh is not just a symbol of change. He is the initial milestone of a new era to the Middle East. The decision to raise economic sanctions against Syria, in force since Assad's dictatorship, has the potential to completely transform the regional panorama. After decades of isolation and civil war, Syria opens the doors to the world, and Ahmed Allah presents itself not only as a leader who overthrew an oppressive regime, but as a statesman who seeks to rebuild his country and reposition it in the global arena. Ahmed's promise to open the Syrian market to Western companies is a clear attempt to attract necessary investments to reconstruct a devastated country. With destroyed infrastructure, collapsed public services, and millions of displaced people, Syria urgently needs capital and expertise to resume their economic growth. Cooperation with the US and Western allies is not just an economic opportunity, but a strategic step in ensuring that Syria is not fertile ground for unwanted external groups and external interference. One of the most revolutionary aspects of this meeting was Donald Trump's pressure for Syria to advance the normalization of relations with Israel, aligning with the Agreement of Abraham, which already includes Arab countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. If this happens, it will be a turning point in relations in the Middle East, a step that has long seemed impossible due to decades of hostilities, wars, and deep suspicions. Peace between Syria and Israel could pave the way for greater stability and stimulate other countries to follow the example. But this change does not occur without internal challenges. Ahmed Allah faces resistance within Syria, political groups, ethnic factions, and sectors of the population that see the approach to Israel and the West as a betrayal or a threat to national identity. Ahmed's ability to manage these internal tensions will be crucial to the sustainability of this new foreign policy. In addition, normalization can trigger tensions in the region, especially with actors such as Iran, which sees Syrian change as a strategic loss and can try to resume influence by different means. Iran's influence on Syria was for a long time a pillar of the Assad regime, especially through support for groups such as Hezbollah. With Syria moving away from this alliance, Iran loses a fundamental basis for projecting its power in the uprising. This realignment directly benefits Saudi Arabia, whose Prince Mohammed bin Salman was critical to convincing Trump to adopt this new stance. The weakening of the Iranian presence in the country contributes to the historical rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, consolidating Riyadh as protagonist of regional policy. Geopolitically, a Syria that allies with Israel and the West can significantly weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon, reducing transfrontier tensions and threats that have marked the last decade. This, in turn, could encourage other Arab countries to reconsider their positions in relation to Israel, expanding Abraham's agreement and promoting a broader and cooperative regional coalition. The transformation of the political map of the Middle East would be deep, with direct reflexes on safety, trade, and global diplomacy. However, despite optimism and promises, the way ahead is full of uncertainties. The political and economic reforms that Ahmed Allah needs to implement to ensure stability and growth will require skill and courage. Internal resistances, social challenges, and the risk of conflict can delay or even compromise this new phase. The international community will also play a critical role, supporting or pressuring that progress is real and not just symbolic. In short, the historic meeting in Riyadh between Donald Trump and Ahmed Allah not only breaks a cycle of decades of isolation from Syria, but inaugurates a new dynamic in the Middle East, with potential gains for peace, economy, and regional security. If this bet is well, it will be one of the most important chapters in the recent history of the region. However, the future remains uncertain, and only time will say whether this approach will be sustainable or if new tensions will emerge. The world observes attentive, as decisions made now have the power to shape the destination of millions of people and the global geopolitical balance for many years.